The topic of environmental sustainability and climate change is one of the world's most prevalent and highly discussed issues. To quote Simon Steele of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, "We're running out of time but not out of options to address climate change." In addition to the climate crisis, food insecurity has proven to be another persistent and relevant issue. According to the United States Department of Agriculture, there were an estimated 1.3 billion people who were food insecure in 2022. We're living in a society where current global terrestrial food by farming systems are consistently threatened by supply chain issues, conflicts, humanitarian crises, pandemics, and climate change. This in turn leads to even more food insecurity for millions of people, meaning they lack access to sufficient food or food of adequate quality to meet their basic needs. The EPA states that agriculture is very sensitive to weather and climate. It also relies heavily on land, water, and other natural resources that climate affects. Providing a more environmentally stable tool for the production of viable food sources will help us to combat food insecurity while minimizing our contribution to the current climate crisis. This is why we believe the acceleration of marine aquaculture will deliver more efficient and sustainable seafood production, thus leading to an increase of food security for Americans and people around the world. Now, to clarify what we mean, marine or open ocean aquaculture involves the cultivation of fish and other aquatic organisms in the sea. Also referred to as offshore fish farming, this includes the fostering and collection of marine organisms in areas that are a considerable distance from the coast or shore. Through this debate, my partner and I will discuss how the acceleration of open ocean aquaculture will deliver greater food security around the world and how it is more environmentally sustainable than terrestrial and traditional farming. We believe the considered way mechanism of this debate should be who can best provide a more immediate solution to the food insecurity crisis. This brings me to our first argument. Open ocean aquaculture is more sustainable than traditional fish farming and terrestrial farming methods. Cows and other land animals contribute to extreme levels of harmful emissions that are released into the atmosphere. A 2021 study on meat consumption found that wild fish and other types of seafood produced only 1/6 of the emissions of beef. In addition to fish being one of the most carbon-efficient foods on the planet, wild-caught fish do not require land or fresh water, leading to lower impact on other wildlife. Furthermore, no marine fish has ever gone extinct due to overfishing. Sustainable Fisheries UW highlights two advantages to eating wild-caught fish over land-based food: space and water. They state that terrestrial agriculture and livestock production use over 50% of the world's arable land and accounts for over 90% of freshwater use. The struggles faced by agricultural farmers to produce crops and food due to climate change highlights the need for an additional tool for feeding people. According to the UN World Food Program USA, climate shocks like droughts and floods kill crops and livestock, degrade soils, damage infrastructure, and drive up food prices. When that happens, conflict, displacement, and mass migration often follow. People will not stand idly by when they cannot feed their families. So we say that we cannot continue to be so reliant on land-based farming and food when we know that it is not sustainable and that climate change is going to continue to destroy crops and decrease the food supply. Open ocean aquaculture advancements will provide additional means for getting food to those who are food insecure and those who will begin to and continue to struggle with food insecurity as climate change progresses and worsens. We believe that offshore fish farming should not and would not be used as a replacement for terrestrial farming, but instead as a transitional tool to help alleviate the stress land farmers endure as we find a more sustainable long-term solution to food insecurity and becoming more sustainable. This brings me to our next point, that the acceleration of marine aquaculture will provide an additional tool for increasing food security. According to the USDA, food insecurity currently affects over 34 million people in the United States alone. This startling statistic also includes over 9 million children. Expanding on fish farming operations will deliver more efficient and sustainable seafood production, leading to an increase of food security. This acceleration will also help to provide food security by increasing the availability of locally produced seafood. This can be particularly important for coastal communities that may rely on fishing as a primary source of income and food. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the U.S. imports between 70 to 85% of its seafood, and it is estimated that over half of this is produced via foreign aquaculture. This statistic seems ridiculous considering we have over 95,000 miles of shoreline in the U.S. We should be using our access to oceans to our advantage by sourcing food locally to reduce emissions from imports. Through sourcing our own seafood via the acceleration of offshore fishing, we can put less money into shipping seafood across nations, which will reduce emissions produced during the exporting processes. Locally sourced seafood would lead to a better impact environmentally if more nations are able to rely on their own products rather than imports. To conclude, we'd like to emphasize that our solution is best for challenging the status quo. This acceleration will provide a means for addressing issues head-on in a way that provides more immediate results. Fish farming is a vital tool that can be used to take action against these issues of climate change and food insecurity in a more immediate and efficient manner. We understand that this is not a perfect mechanism and that the end goal is to reduce food insecurity. However, aquaculture is the best in-between way to help us to get to where we need to be with the resources that we have now. People are hungry right now, and we cannot afford to invest in agriculture that has not been sustainable and will continue to suffer due to the harsh effects of climate change. If you believe that we should be doing everything we can right now to invest in a food system that produces significantly less carbon emissions while more immediately providing adequate food to those who are food insecure, then you agree with our motion that is in favor for the acceleration of open ocean aquaculture. Thank you.
Okay, are you ready for process?
Yes.
So I'm going to start with the first question on the scope of the debate. When you're weighing your cost-benefit analysis, are you looking at benefits to the United States or benefits to the world?
I mean, right here, we're looking mostly at the United States, but we feel that our research can also apply to other places around the world, too.
What in the resolution implies that we be focused on the United States?
So right now, most of our statistics that we're going off of are talking about the food insecurity numbers in the United States. And what we're saying is that we need to start using our shorelines in the United States specifically to increase our aquaculture production.
Okay. So on to one of your first points, you mentioned that traditional agriculture is very sensitive to climate change. Is aquaculture not sensitive to climate change?
So we're specifically talking about the land that is available to us. And so, yes, there are going to be factors that are influenced by climate change. However, land is going to become less and less available as we see these negative impacts of climate change exacerbated. So we're not going to be able to plant the crops that we need. We're not going to be able to keep the animals that we need. So we're saying that as land, through these droughts, through these floods that have been here and that are going to continue to come and worsen, that we should look to our oceans to provide a solution for these disparities.
What about climate change effects that are traditionally, specifically in the ocean? For example, ocean acidification, raising ocean temperatures that will threaten marine life.
So part of our acceleration process would be to invest in infrastructure and things that would lessen this. So we're going deeper out into the ocean. So there are stronger currents. Instead of doing closer to the shore, we're going offshore, so there's more currents, so we can eliminate waste, and the water is getting cleared out more and more. So we're saying that we should be doing this in a way, and also the acceleration will include research that will help us to be more sustainable in the long run.
Okay. On to another point. You make a point about how terrestrial agriculture is still going to exist in the affirmative world. So my question is, so the affirmative is looking to offshore aquaculture as a new agricultural technologies. Are other agricultural technologies like cellular agriculture reasonable in the neg world under your scope?
Can you say that last part one more time?
Yeah, are other agricultural technologies not offshore aquaculture, but say accelerating cellular agriculture and cellular aquaculture, are those fair in the neg world under the scope that you're creating?
Yes, fair.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, on to your second point where you're talking about increasing food security. So it's much of your evidence is U.S. specific, but I want to talk for a second about developing nations. And will developing nations have the same luxury of cheaper food and a competitive food market where we're accelerating the United States production of aquaculture?
So our burden is to tell you why specifically we think that this is desirable. And so we're saying that it's desirable because it will provide additional means for getting food to people. And what we're saying is that specific to the US, yes, we have these shorelines that we should be using. We should be using them to our advantage, but that's not to say that other countries can't do the same thing.
Okay, but thinking about how that's going to play out on a global stage, if the United States is accelerating its own aquaculture, how is that going to impact access on global markets? And how how can we ensure that there's going to be any fairness there?
So you're saying, how can we ensure that there's going to be fairness in, I guess I'm just not understanding the question.
How can we ensure that developing nations are also going to see the food security impacts that you talk about?
So I think that this can be ensured by accelerating and seeing that it is efficient. We can then bring it to other places.
Okay, and that's the end of my question again.
You guys ready?
Yes.
We negate resolve, acceleration of open ocean aquaculture development would be desirable. Acceleration of open ocean aquaculture is not desirable when we could achieve many of the potential environmental, economic, and social benefits that the AF discusses through the means that won't cause nearly as much undue destruction to the environment. For this debate, we define open ocean aquaculture as the rearing of marine organisms in exposed areas beyond significant coastal influence, a definition adopted from the Congressional Research Report, or Service Report. Acceleration we define as to happen or to make something happen sooner or faster. Desirable in this context of the debate, desirable means net positive impacts compared to the world where we don't accelerate it. Accelerating an agricultural technology that is new and in an undeveloped regulatory landscape and environment of worsening climate change will have negative net impacts with the complexity of the current regulatory regime. If we don't push for acceleration of this technology, we're not given time to figure out how to do it right. There are potential benefits to open ocean aquaculture only if we have enough time to adequately research best practices and develop policies to mitigate harms, something inherently contradictory to the AF's argument for acceleration. Our first contention is the dicey regulatory regime that encompasses the current use of international water use law. The question of who has the right to the ocean has historically been and will continue to be controversial. It will become exceedingly controversial as we accelerate open ocean aquaculture in the AF world. In 1982, the UN convened the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea to develop a framework for governing the use of the ocean. The result of this law of the sea was a comprehensive regime of law and order in the world's oceans, and a departure from the previous freedom of seas doctrine that had governed for prior centuries. This treaty has thus been ratified but not been signed onto nations, including the United States, because of concerns of how the UN designates who has economic autonomy and access to marine spaces. Under the law of the sea, most nations have exclusive jurisdiction up to 12 miles off the coast and exclusive economic access up to 200. But what about that of beyond 200 miles? What about areas where countries' jurisdictions overlap? Unclear boundaries in water will lead to international geopolitical conflicts over who has the right to what part of the ocean and its resources. It will also lead to international conflicts over ocean pollution via aquaculture, since some nations are more likely to haphazardly pollute via aquaculture than others. These international conflicts will then cause supply chain issues, trade embargoes, and overall political strain. Our second contention to the AF's argument is the lack of sound science. This contention boils down to one fact. We know very little about the ocean, and we have not taken much effort to learn about it. The key point is that the acceleration of the open ocean aquaculture is not necessarily going to be met with the acceleration of scientifically sound policy, since especially the international laws governing the sea's uses are complicated. The Economist reports that life underwater, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal related to marine life, is underfunded, receiving 0.01% of all Sustainable Development Goal funding from the development finance up to 2019, and only 0.56% of all philanthropic funding since 2016. Additionally, more than 80% of the ocean is unmapped, unobserved, and unexplored. Connecting the dots, if we're not spending money on researching how to improve life underwater, we don't know what interactions with the ocean could potentially be destructive. Therefore, acceleration is futile. Consider the chemical and nutrient inputs necessary to feed aquaculture stock. Acceleration of aquaculture leads to accelerated dumping excess of highly concentrated nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen into the ocean. On land and near shore, we've already seen nutrient excess related to agricultural activities destroy bodies of water by creating dead zones through eutrophication. The Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi Delta are just somber examples of this. We don't know about how much excess nutrients could potentially impact marine ecosystems, but we know very little about marine ecosystems. We know very little about marine ecosystems, and especially ecosystems further offshore and deeper under the sea. We also need more research into how diseases can spread from the captive marine communities to wild marine communities and how these ecosystems might affect marine life and their food chains. Without this knowledge, disease can spread from farm populations to other marine life populations, which could potentially cripple marine species, alter marine food chains, and subsequently the supply of wild marine life for human consumption. In addition to these predictable problems, we don't know what we don't know about the ocean because we've also spent so little time and energy trying to understand. So, in summary, in the AF world, we see uncertainty in the regulatory and fiscal environment. We see this uncertainty manifest itself as potential geopolitical conflicts, trade wars, species loss, ocean degradation, and related food insecurity, especially in vulnerable coastal communities. For these reasons, on balance, the neg world is preferred to the AF world. Circling back around, I just want to kind of touch on the whole regulatory landscape as a whole and then the ongoing environmental impacts that are in need of further assessment. There's ultimately an authoritative issue of who has what access to the sea's aquatic resources, as well as the manipulation of those spaces that these entities will act in. There's uncertainty with overall agency prioritization, as the United States already has strict permit requirements through multiple agencies of who governs what use of water. Fast policy is rarely good policy, so if we choose to accelerate the policies through congressional bodies, then we ultimately might be playing our cards wrong into further environmental degradation. Further, in assessing these environmental impacts, there's issues of pollution, further pollution with fishing nets, excess nutrient eutrophication, dead zones, increased levels of dissolved oxygen, as well as the introduction of potentially invasive species which could harm ecosystems and cause trophic cascades. And so with that, this is we negate the resolve. And I'm open to cross examination.
Okay, so you said that we don't really know how this is going to affect marine ecosystems. So if we don't know how it's going to affect it, then how can you prove that this acceleration would be harmful and therefore not desirable?
Well, I'm not saying that researching this is a bad thing, but I'm just saying right now in terms of the idea of accelerating this process, it should not be accelerated due to the fact that there's not sound information regarding what type of spaces would best habitat these sort of species, what conditions would best suit them, as well as the long-term implications of long-term presence within the open ocean. So we are basically emphasizing precaution in terms of acceleration.
Okay, so why can't we have both accelerated open ocean aquaculture and accelerated research simultaneously?
Well, again, there's no regulatory regime. If you're going to have people researching, they're going to have to be under certain guidelines and standardizations, but those are not anywhere to be found.
Are those mutually exclusive though? So we're saying that if we accelerate open ocean, you're saying that if we accelerate open ocean aquaculture, there will be no limits on it? Because that's not the claim that we're making.
I'm not saying there's no limits, but there's currently no statutory principles nor any universal governance of how jurisdictions will be laid out.
So would you argue that the acceleration of marine aquaculture would be desirable then if we are also accelerating research and we are also putting effort into placing restrictions on what we can do to the ocean, who has access to the ocean?
But this is the topic of debate. It's not necessarily accelerating the research. We're talking accelerating the actual process and basically shipping all of our known assets and information about aquaculture to these sites in the open ocean.
So you say that we don't know what we don't know about the ocean. So why can't we continue to work with what we do know and what has been working in the past and accelerate what we do know is working with the resources that are available to us, while in order to attack the issues of food insecurity head on and to feed people, while also emphasizing the importance of research?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, so why can't we continue to work and use what we do know about open ocean aquaculture right now and accelerate it via what we do know about the ocean and what we do know works?
Because of the long-term implications of this. In the past, the US and other countries have gone a long time without exercising precaution, and look where we're at. We have a climate crisis.
So what do you propose would be a desirable alternative to open?
Looking into things such as cellular agriculture, for example, there is seafood cellular agriculture, cell-grown seafood, from a clean tech startup called Finless Foods, where they basically have taken measures to replicate bluefin tuna, which has been recently threatened by predatory fishing practices. This is already a safe and sound model that does not have any net environmental devastation or further health implications, as opposed to traditional farming and aquatic aquaculture. So looking into these already scientifically sound alternatives is like probably the best solution to move forward before we choose to accelerate this sort of thing, because again, we want to accelerate that research, which is great, but we also should look at the opportunities and take into account what is safe and sound for us right now.
Do you not think that these two things can coexist though?
They most definitely could coexist, but I also do think that, one, we don't know enough about the ocean and the long-term implications of what open ocean aquaculture, specifically in the deep sea, is going to do to those like native species that we probably might not even know about that could suffer as a result. So that's why I'm saying, like, if we emphasize other alternatives that are safer on land and do not exhaust existing land use and properties for like not even using like terrestrial farming, but like just using research labs in general, we can upscale and optimize on this while also furthering our research for open ocean aquaculture.
Okay. Everyone good?
We're at a point in society where we can look at the world and identify many major areas that need to be addressed to ensure that we are able to support ourselves and generations for years to come. But there are a few issues more immediate than our climate and food insecurity crises. During this debate, we've explored the importance of providing food insecurity and how we can do that sustainably and ethically. When we look at feeding a growing population, we already have this important, useful innovation of open ocean aquaculture at our disposal, and we need to maximize its potential through acceleration. The acceleration is desirable because it's a tool that helps us deliver greater food insecurity around the world in a more sustainable way than current farming and livestock methods. Like we said before, we are already suffering a food shortage issue. Feeding America reports that in the home states of ACC member institutions alone, there are more than 10.6 million people who are facing hunger. That said, we believe that the winning team of this debate must provide immediate support for this crisis. And during my time, I'm going to take some time to rebut the opposition's arguments, rebuild my partner's arguments, and finally explain why I believe we've won the debate thus far. First, I'd like to respond to the other team's arguments. They seem to depend a lot on the idea that we don't have information. I believe that's a reason why we should accelerate. I believe that acceleration can also be scope. We're growing rather than just immediately implementing this program, and I think that research is important. You also agreed that your plan and our plan can coexist, so I don't understand how that kind of implies that ours is undesirable or unrealistic if you feel that they can't coexist together. They also say that we have negative net impact if we don't have the time to do it right. I feel that we need to develop best practices. That is a part of acceleration. It includes research. We already see research occurring at ACC institutions like UMiami, and there's many different organizations like NOAA and different nonprofits who are looking into how to do this sustainably so that way when we do expand, we have the research behind it. They also mentioned how there's political issues of who owns the water, what areas beyond. In their own definition that they use of what open ocean aquaculture is, if you continue that definition, it talks about how that kind of goes to 3 to 200 miles beyond the shoreline. That's the EEZ zone, which was defined by the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. Many of these countries know what land. I don't know why we're assuming that we're going to have to go out past this area. This is a very extensive area, especially as we're looking to develop. And so I feel like it's speculation that we're going to have to go out of these areas and it's going to cause political issues because we have this mutual understanding. And we also do have current governing bodies like NOAA. And I think that with issues with rules, we can implement them just like we have with overfishing and other fishing issues that we've seen before. As well, they talk about how they believe that there's no sound science. I believe that the problem is that we're underfunded. They talk about how we don't know what's out there. Therefore, we believe an investment is needed. They say that makes acceleration futile, but we believe that that's a reason that we should accelerate. They also talk about environmental issues. Genevieve, my partner, talked about how open ocean aquaculture has less environmental issues than other ways to feed people, and that they can coexist even with their issues. I'd like to rebuild some of my partner's arguments. First, she highlighted that open ocean aquaculture is more sustainable than traditional fish farming and terrestrial farming efforts. in their questions, they were wondering, how does this affect the climate? We believe that, there are still climate change effects in the ocean. We talked about how this is significantly less than other things we have, and so while acceleration, there might be some issues in the ocean with carbon, there are way more issues on land, and so we need to look at minimizing that, which is where we turn to the ocean. As well as Genevieve highlighted, with the currents, it takes away a lot of those issues with waste or disease that we have traditionally seen with fishing. Open ocean aquaculture kind of eliminates a lot of those environmental or sustainability worries. Genevieve brought up important statistics about how fish not only produce carbon at a sixth the rate of red meat, but they use less land and water. Climate change is threatening our land and fresh water, and the World Wildlife Federation estimates that by 2025, 2/3 of the world's population will be facing water shortages. So the advantage of open ocean aquaculture make it incredibly desirable as we look to feed our population. We've seen extreme weather wipe out farms, droughts. Studies from the UN believe that without proper adaptation, global yields of crops could decline by up to 30% by 2050. And so we're saying that we can't be reliant on the land because of current climate change, so we need to look to the sea. And open ocean aquaculture is our most sustainable, reliable, and immediate option. Next, my partner explained how the acceleration of marine aquaculture will help provide an additional tool for increasing food security. Food insecurity currently affects 34 million people in the United States, and expanding fish farming will increase food access. And because we import so much of our seafood, increased domestic production through open ocean aquaculture ensures that we can supplement properly to meet current demand, and that we have the proper foundation to support that demand should one of our major trading partners suffer from their own weather incident or other issues. As we expand on these operations, it will increase the availability of fish, become more accessible to more people. A robust investment is needed to allow for proper and cutting-edge technology and equipment that can withstand the ocean's temperamental nature. So while offshore fishing provides a technological and spatial fix to constraints from land-based food production, and as we face issues like droughts and natural disasters, we must supplement our food supply in some way. In conclusion, open ocean aquaculture is not only a viable solution to food insecurity, but also one of the best options that we currently have on hand. Anything that decreases issues of the status quo is something desirable that we should be working towards, and we are making the status quo better by reducing global emissions and increasing food production. Open ocean aquaculture is a desirable solution because it's an important tool that we need to utilize. We have the technology, the system can be implemented quickly to meet immediate needs that food insecurity is presenting domestically and worldwide. We don't want to look back 5 or 10 years from now and wish we acted when we saw what was happening, and we still have the chance to implement measures to address our food crisis. A vote for the affirmative is a vote for investing our future today to ensure that we're able to feed our population in a sustainable way.
So, I want to touch on one of your points about political constraints and your mention of NOAA. So, do you believe that NOAA regulates agriculture within the United States?
So they are they're an NGO, and they help work towards the ocean and researching, and so they can help guide that. But I'm not saying that they're going to immediately implement regulations themselves because they're just an NGO.
So regardless of that, does the United States regulate agriculture, including aquaculture?
Yeah, we have multiple organizations, whether it's, farming or current agriculture, we have standards to make sure that things are, par, that people are healthy. And so maybe aquaculture hasn't really been included in that because hasn't been accelerated to the point that maybe governments have been noticing it. But I think that, there are standards of how you produce food, how it's distributed. That can be, then aquaculture can be brought into that.
Under which U.S. statutory regime would that best fit?
I don't know. I think it's depending on what issues we're about. So if it's environmental issues, then the EPA would probably be, I think it's collaboration of multiple organizations depending on what your concerns are. I don't think one organization, defines it all.
Well, I do know under the Clean Water Act, which is our only federal governing document regarding water use, it does not entail that any federal agency can regulate agriculture, even with freshwater uses. So I don't necessarily know how that might translate to aquaculture, but moving on, you also did mention the ethical practices involved, and your specific U.S. scope kind of makes me question the overall international social ethics of how we are actually going to fairly and equitably distribute the burdens and benefits of aquaculture.
So,
Especially to those who have existing loss and damages to their to their own communities, especially like in Southeast Asia, where they're tremendously already their economies are severely shot. So can you just
yeah, so, Southeast Asia is actually where we import most of our fish from. They have those resources, and I think that, as we develop open ocean aquaculture, as Genevieve said, a lot of our information is US-based, but that doesn't mean that what we learn in the United States isn't going to go to other countries. We think that providing an additional opportunity for food, providing a different resource for food, is desirable. And so we're not saying we're producing this fish and only the United States gets to learn how to do it and we're only going to learn. If there's more food, there's more opportunities to feed people. That can go to these different countries. It's not saying that only the wealthier countries are going to have access to it. Once we learn to accelerate it and how to kind of make it more sustainable, we can kind of continue that to other countries.
When you also mentioned desirability, how does the current landscape, regarding, obviously, food insecurity is an issue. We all want to produce more food, but in the most equitable way without basically expanding U.S. economic imperialism across the globe, how can you ensure that there are going to be regulatory frameworks to basically uphold your desire to achieve accelerated open ocean aquaculture?
So I think we have tried to say, maybe there's not regulations now in the United States and other countries, because the reason we're debating it is because this is a fairly new idea that we're researching. It might be something that we're not aware of. The United States is not the only people who have open ocean aquaculture. There are Finland's doing it, Chile's doing it, Newfoundland's doing it. There's many countries who are doing it. And so we're not imposing what we're doing on them. I believe that we, as the United States, need to research our best practices and share them, so that way across the globe we can implement open ocean aquaculture as sustainably as possible. But I believe that each country, based on their shoreline, their food, how everything works, they need to implement the right, regulations for their country.
Okay, so let's think about the context in which this debate is framed. The AF has framed this debate in such a way that we're essentially debating over what has the greater consequence for increasing food security in the short term. So that's how I'm going to focus the impacts of the net, and I have three main points that I want to touch on. The first point is that climate change is a global problem that needs a global solution, and climate change is impacting every sector of the environment. The affirmative argues that climate change is having worse impacts on land than underwater. That is simply not true. Global temperatures are rising, including in the sea. There is ocean acidification happening in the waters, making it harder for marine life to live. Essentially, climate change is also exacerbated in the ocean, and the affirmative doesn't provide any evidence that this is not the case, so you shouldn't believe and buy into this argument. Additionally, they also argue, I'll get to that second. The second main point that I want to touch on is that acceleration of development does not inherently include acceleration of research, and especially acceleration of good research. They make this argument, but they have absolutely zero links here. Consider, even say that research is accelerated. Who is going to be doing this research? Most likely, it's going to be the corporate interests invested in making a profit, and they're going to be biased to sway the research towards whatever is going to, build their bottom dollar. And additionally, they also make the argument about how acceleration of research is imminent in the future, and that there are lots of opportunities to learn more, and that and that research is essentially a new idea, and that the reason that we don't have this landscape built out is because this is all new. However, this is not a new idea. As we mentioned in our first contention, the law of the sea has been around since 1982. This is the law that's been governing ocean use and access. We've been thinking about this for a long time, and we still don't have the research, we still don't have the data, we still don't have any information, assuming that this is going to be a good idea. Third, and probably the most important point that I can bring up in this debate today, is that climate change is a global issue, and this revolution asks us to look at this issue globally. Now, while my opponents have done a great job at looking at the economic, social, and environmental impacts of the United States, they fail to recognize the harms abroad. For example, consider that we do accelerate open ocean aquaculture in the United States, and we reduce the need for imports. What does this do to markets in Southeast Asia abroad? These markets will likely collapse because there's going to be nobody to buy those fish. Consequently, this is actually going to harm the most vulnerable populations in the world. Even though there are millions of food insecure Americans, and this is very important, there are also millions of food insecure people all around the world, and especially in the global south. And considering the fact that climate change has disproportionate impacts on these more vulnerable populations, we're actually going to be making the issue of food insecurity much worse in the AF world based on their proposal. Now, I know that the affirmative is probably going to respond to this by saying that the developing world also could develop offshore aquaculture and try to respond to this in the same way. But if you think about it logically, are they really going to have the resources to do that? And considering the fact that we have an uncertain regulatory landscape, which went relatively unchecked in the first contention, it seems very unlikely that there's going to be international cooperation to try to push it the other way. The consequence of this is that developing nations are going to see harsh consequences for their economies. Their economies, or their fishing economies specifically, are going to crash because there's going to be nobody to buy those fish. Additionally, this means that people are going to have less spending power, people aren't going to be able to spend as much money, and there's going to be an overflow of fish on the market, and quite frankly, it leads to very poor economic consequences for these areas. Additionally, I'd like to add that distribution is the issue when we consider food insecurity. Food insecurity is not necessarily a matter of we don't have enough food to feed enough people. The issue is that we don't have the social, political, and economic structures in place that can feed everybody. Think about how much food waste there is in the United States alone. Now, the AFS world does nothing to combat this issue. Additionally, they don't do really anything to combat the issue of hidden hunger in these developing nations as well. Hidden hunger meaning that they don't have access to, the good quality proteins, the good quality vitamins and minerals that will combat the worst health effects like maternal mortality, etc. And again, touching back, I want to also make a fourth point about our second contention, kind of rebuilding our second contention. They argue that invasive species, nutrient excess from the research that we have currently available aren't going to be big issues, but that's the entire point of our second contention. 80% of the ocean is unmapped. 0.01% of all spending on the SDGs goes to actually researching the ocean. 0.01%, that is a minuscule number compared to how much we're investing in affordable energy, investing in reducing inequities. And quite frankly, it's a number that definitely does not invoke confidence in the fact that we know what we're talking about when we're approaching the ocean. Simply put, they have these arguments that invasive species and nutrient excess aren't as big of a deal as we make them out to be. Our point is, because we don't know about them, not knowing about something doesn't mean that the impacts aren't bad. It means that we should take a precautionary approach and we should try to learn more before we haphazardly increase acceleration of this technology. So, Judge, bringing it back to food insecurity, if you look at the effects on the global market, food insecurity writ large will increase, even if food insecurity in the United States decreases. And with that, I urge a vote in the negative.
So you talk about how the acceleration of development doesn't include research and how we need more research. Who do you believe needs to carry out that research to where we can get to a point where the acceleration will be desirable?
I think that research needs to be carried out by a variety of actors, but especially non-governmental organizations and academic institutions and political institutions that don't necessarily have the same vested interests as corporations who are going to be making a cut of the profit.
You also talk about how, like you said, 80% of the ocean is unmapped. How much of that is in the zones that we are using for open ocean aquaculture, that 3 to 200?
I'm not completely sure.
So could it be that the 20% that we've mapped is what's closest to our coast, what's most successful, what we would be using and what we do know about?
I mean, if you're going to make that argument, that would be your prerogative to prove that link. That's not my prerogative to prove that link.
So you believe that organizations are invested in making profit, yes?
I believe that corporations taking advantage of accelerating development are invested in making a profit, yes. Yes.
Okay, so wouldn't corporations be then invested in selling this product to people and making sure that it is accessible to people who can't purchase it?
I mean, they have an incentive to make sure that they can sell it at the highest price possible.
Okay. But if they're selling at the highest price possible, isn't that kind of eliminating a lot of the market? We have other fishing options, so wouldn't they want to price competitively?
I'm not sure that I understand what you're asking.
So you're kind of assuming that these corporations are automatically going to produce the highest caliber fish. Like if we're producing beef, we're automatically producing Wagyu. We're not producing ground beef. Okay, so you believe that these could be competitively priced fish?
I believe that they could be competitively priced, but no matter what you do, if you're adding a huge influx onto the market, it's going to screw with the markets.
Wouldn't supply and demand believe that more supply would be lower
If you
prices?
drastically increase supply, that doesn't necessarily mean that demand drastically increases as well as a response.
So then wouldn't prices lower because there's not as much demand?
Prices could lower domestically, but again, my point is about global markets and the impact on global markets. My point here isn't only about the expansion of open ocean aquaculture from the United States, but the fact that that expansion and reducing imports from developing nations in Southeast Asia is going to wreck Southeast Asian fishing economies.
So when you are mentioning the law of the sea, are you talking about that UN law?
Yes, a 1982 UN treaty.
Okay, so then if you're using this law of the sea, would you propose the UN as a governing body? So
No, I'm not proposing the United Nations as a governing body. In fact, my argument is that the United Nations is a bad actor and they can't necessarily enforce anything, and that the regulatory environment is too feeble.
Do you believe that lowering climate change is desirable?
Yes.
With cellular fishing, are you proposing any change in the rate of current fishing or harvesting that we're doing?
I mean, we didn't lay anything out in our framework, if that's what you mean.
Okay.
Alright, we've heard a lot of different arguments today, but the affirmative believes wholeheartedly that the topic of food insecurity is the most prevalent and urgent issue. What I'm going to do through this speech is prove that the negative failed to provide details for the lack of desirability for our plan. Our simple message is that we are helping to make the status quo better. The issues of climate change are going to increasingly limit our access to land. This lack of access will lead to detrimental impacts on our land animals, our terrestrial agricultural production, and therefore our food resources. Land will be so much less accessible and consistent as time goes on and as the climate crisis continues, and we need to look for our oceans for resources. This is why we say it is most desirable to invest in the acceleration of open ocean aquaculture and what we currently do know about what it can provide. The acceleration of this process is favorable. What we are saying is that open ocean aquaculture is a tool that we should be using right now, and that its acceleration would be favorable. It produces less carbon than land farming while also providing an additional means for feeding people. We provided evidence from a 2021 study by a doctor of toxicology that wild fish and other types of seafood produced only 1/6 of the emissions of beef. And he also labels fish as one of the most carbon efficient foods on the planet. So it is true that this is significantly more carbon efficient. Therefore, we should be accelerating open ocean aquaculture to attack the issues of food insecurity head on. Also, wild-caught fish do not require land or fresh water, leading to a lower impact on wildlife that we see in land-based farming. Sure, open ocean aquaculture will come with its challenges, but so will its alternatives. We can clearly see that the net emissions from aquaculture is much less than land farming. And like we said, this can provide a transitional tool that can help us to get to a more sustainable future. As Allison also emphasized, that the opposition agreed that open ocean aquaculture acceleration can coexist with other efforts such as cellular food to provide a more long-term solution. So if we agree that these two things can coexist, we say that this acceleration is desirable because it offers an additional tool for increasing food security with less harm to the environment than other terrestrial methods. They're also claim dropping here saying that cellular options will be better, but fail to provide evidence. We didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about how these cellular options will be better. We don't know if there is research out there that these cellular options will be better, but we provided you sound evidence and statistics that do show that the emissions are much less with fish farming than it is with terrestrial methods. We also know that we have the infrastructure and we have the ability to do these things. We can go out into the ocean. We've been doing it. So therefore, accelerating is only going to help us in the future when we are looking for places to get more food. In the opposition's world, we're neglecting the use of resources that we have available to us via the acceleration of open ocean aquaculture. We're living in fear of what might happen to the climate while simultaneously restricting our use of resources in the ocean that can be used to feed people who are hungry right now. The opposition says that we do not prove that this acceleration will be more sustainable. However, we talked about how the U.S. imports between 70 to 85% of its seafood, and it is estimated that over half of this is produced via foreign aquaculture. Through limiting our imports, we are going to see a significant decrease in emissions. Again, we also provided evidence that fish is one of the most carbon efficient foods, producing only a fraction of emissions from other land-based proteins. Sure, open ocean aquaculture is going to contribute to some emissions, but so will the alternatives. And we can clearly see that open ocean aquaculture does this on a way lesser scale than land farming. Like we said, this can provide a transitional tool as we are looking to help feed people. Carbon emissions are an issue, but what is their solution? Where is their research? Also, what does it matter if the environment is going to be damaged if people cannot get food to eat? If we're going to die from hunger, then who cares if the world is burning? The world is going under, but we aren't even here to survive it because we can't eat. Our opponents also speculate that the nations we source our seafood from will experience a collapse in their economies if we're sourcing our own products. We argue that we are so interdependent with these other countries that they're referring to that fish production will not be the tipping point that leads to the collapse of their economies and throw away the relationships we have with them. Even if there is proof that this would be the case, we didn't hear it today. So what we're saying is that a lot of this is speculation, and we're not relying on other countries, and countries aren't relying on us solely for seafood. And so we argue that accelerating our production here is desirable and favorable. If other countries want to expand on that and do it as well, we could also see that being favorable in the future. So to conclude, I want us to all think about what we saw and how people reacted during the pandemic. People went and cleared the shelves in grocery stores before we even hinted at not having enough food available to us. This mass panic will be seen on an exponential scale as climate change continues to destroy crops through droughts, floods, and other extreme weather. Imagine as food insecurity becomes worse and we don't have enough land to continue with agricultural farming and production demands. Food insecurity is not going away. We need to look to our oceans as another resource to provide this food. We understand that this is not a perfect mechanism and that the end goal is to reduce food insecurity. We are reiterating that aquaculture is the best in-between way to help us to get to where we need to be. People are hungry now, and we cannot afford to invest in agriculture that has not been sustainable and will continue to suffer due to the harsh effects of climate change. If you believe that we should be doing everything we can right now to invest in a food system that produces significantly less carbon emissions, while more immediately providing food to people who need it, then you agree with our motion that is in favor for the acceleration of open ocean aquaculture. Thank you.
At the top, I'm going to start with the framing on the debate and what you should be making a voting decision on. The voting decision, as stated by the affirmative, all comes down to global food security. How many people are going to have immediate access to food in the near future? And we agree, and we say that the negation actually wins this point. I have 3 reasons why. And the first and most obvious is the impact on global markets. If we accelerate the development of open ocean aquaculture in the way that the affirmative says that we should, which is through the United States, they argue that some other nations can as well, but honestly that wasn't in the plan text of their original case. What we can see is that this is going to wreck local fishing economies abroad who currently rely on the United States as a consumer base for exports. By wrecking these local economies, we're essentially taking away their economic sovereignty. We're making it so that they don't have enough spending power, enough buying power to essentially keep food on their tables and make sure that they can do that. And the impact on global markets, it's a basic supply and demand issue. If we shock the supply so much that we drive prices down in the United States, we're undercutting the price of fish from all other developing nations. And so who's gonna buy fish from that's caught and or farmed from developing nations if they can get it at a lower cost if it's caught or farmed from the United States using open ocean aquaculture? Nobody will. Nobody's going to buy those fish, and therefore those countries and those companies are not going to be getting a source of income. They can't pay their employees, and their employees can't pay for food. It is as simple as that. And although they bring up great points that this could be a good solution to food insecurity in the United States, we're not just talking about the United States. And quite frankly, that's the central problem of this debate that we're talking about right now. This also shows up in our first contention about the uncertain regulatory landscape. The uncertain global regulatory landscape is a huge factor in this debate, and they don't engage with that because they talk about how the regulatory landscape in the United States is favorable for this. My second main point that I want to touch on here is how we need to be taking a precautionary approach. As my partner said in his speech, he mentioned, look, we're not taking a precautionary approach that's gotten us so far. It's gotten us worsening climate change, rising oceans, rising temperatures, ocean acidification, lack of viable land to use for agriculture. Essentially, the approach that the affirmative is advocating for is exactly why we are in this position in the first place. It is absolutely nonsensical to assume that the thing that got us into the problem is also going to be the solution to the problem. And as far as where this precautionary approach is actually going to show up, as far as the lack of sound science, there are a couple of main areas. First of all, excess nutrients in the oceans. This has barely been studied because currently there is very little open ocean aquaculture. However, what we see from excess nutrient use on land is the creation of dead zones through eutrophication, which is essentially a fancy word for saying they deplete all of the oxygen and then none of the animals have oxygen to breathe and then they'll die. Quite frankly, they argue that ocean currents are going to solve for this, but maybe that's true with the information that we have available right now. But if we're advocating for rapid acceleration and expansion of these technologies, that assumption cannot hold without further research. Additionally, we face a similar problem with invasive species and diseases specifically that arise from farmed species that can then spread into wild populations. This has the possibility to create trophic cascades, which essentially means that further and further down the food chain, one diseased fish that spreads disease to other fish and kills those fish is going to have impacts all throughout the food chain, which, you guessed it, will have impacts for human consumption and human fishing. Essentially, the problem here, and what we bring up with our whole second contention, is that we're not being careful enough. This is the same problem that got us here, and the same problem that got us here is not going to be our holy grail. We mentioned that we can use other approaches for acceleration, and we can see that the app can also address those approaches. However, what's unique to the negative is that we can get the benefits from those other approaches like cellular agriculture without all of the harms of excess nutrients, of crashing global markets, of increasing food security writ large abroad. Additionally, a third point that I have here is the issue of scope, or the issue of speed. Because the app is advocating for rapid acceleration, they're not giving vulnerable communities, and specifically global markets, enough time to adapt to this reality, and therefore not enough time to make sure that we're going to see socially equitable and economically equitable impacts of this policy idea. So to kind of take a step back and look at the whole debate, this is what you're voting on. The affirmative has a great plan for increasing food security in the United States. However, when you look at this in the global context, it crashes global markets, wrecks local economies in areas that are already especially vulnerable to climate change and especially vulnerable to exploitation. Additionally, it has the potential to dramatically increase many of the agricultural and environmental issues that we see today, such as invasive species, diseased species, trophic cascades, by messing with migration patterns and eutrophication and dead zones created in the ocean. Weighing these two worlds against each other, and again, coming back to the theme of food security, we can see that the negative world solves for food security for the global population, because we have other innovative approaches that we can take to see better impacts for food security without necessarily wrecking our environment or global markets. So for that, I urge you to vote the negative. Thank you.
very much. I did vote affirmative. Here's why. In your final speech, you even literally concede that the affirmative solves for, or has a lot of solvency for hunger and creating sustainable fish markets in the United States. I know that the reason that you concede that is because you are going for an argument that this creates market collapse. You don't have evidence for that. I know it's an analytical claim that you make, but they are pushing back against that, and they have an argument about how the markets, like the entire economy of a country, is much more interdependent with the US than one specific market, and there's a complexity of how economic collapse happens that would not just mean that one market could collapse an entire country. Maybe that's wrong, but the issue is that this is not a comparison of evidence, this is a comparison of claims. To me, it seems like one market having issues or changing is not enough to collapse the entire economy of the country. And even if, so if there is perhaps some market, it seems like having sustainable, good source of food for a lot of Americans is a good thing that probably would have a bigger impact. You have a counter advocacy, sort of. I know you talk about it in cross-examination, and then it's kind of loosely mentioned, but it's not really a fully developed argument about how there's definitely not enough to go from there's one startup that has grown fish in the lab to this solves for all of the fish issues. And so the affirmative makes a claim or makes an argument that this isn't, that you don't have evidence that this solves for everything. They do have evidence that this is able to, that their plan has 1/6 of the emissions of beef, that it is scalable, and there's a lot of sources that they're drawing from to make this argument that it works. And I just, at a basic level, for me to really consider a counter advocacy, like a full solvency, it needs to be something beyond just something that you mentioned in the cross-examination of a debate. And then another argument that you have is the regulatory landscape. This is unclear, but you have impacts for this in the first speech, which is about potential conflict because states are unsure of what they have control over. But by the end of which is perhaps really interesting, they've said in previous speeches that we're doing this somewhat now. It's actually fairly close to the shoreline when it's pretty clear who's in control of this. But ultimately, when you mention this in your final speech, it's literally just one sentence that says there's an unclear regulatory network. And if this was going to win the debate, there needs to be an explanation of why that matters. And that still needs to be, right, like that needs to be a fully developed argument that goes through and says, here's why that matters more than solving hunger, and just recalling that from 2 speeches ago when it hadn't really been developed since, isn't enough to have that be the whole dissent that you want to debate on. So the thing that gave me the most evaluation, that's not the right word, but is your argument that this could cause negative stuff for the ocean. And there's several things that you mentioned that I didn't write down. I wrote it down on another part of the paper, but not here. But they are making an argument that currents and the way that this unique aquaculture works can solve some of those impacts, but they're also saying that we can do concurrent research. I think that this is where you're getting the most pushback, that you're doing the best in the debate to say that there could be these negative environmental impacts, and we've gone too fast in the past, so we need to slow down. I think ultimately the way that they're framing the debate that I think they win is that solving hunger is the most important thing. And figuring out at least a bridge solution to starting as the environment gets worse and land agriculture becomes less and less viable, that is the biggest priority in the round. And even if there is some, I forget some of the specific, even if there is some negative impacts, we need to try it, and they have evidence that it would work. So that's how I decided the round. I can tell you're upset, so if you want to ask questions, I'm more than willing to talk.